right, well, thanks for having me, and hopefully today we'll talk about some really interesting topics and maybe provoke some thoughts, debate, etc. So the topic that I chose today is a very interesting topic to me. It's rolling out Tempus and working with other clients that use or other customers that use Tempus. We often get into the topic of uh, how do we bring in project schedules and whether we have schedules or not, or how much can we rely on schedules. So it's a topic that being a project manager for much of my career is of a lot of interest to me. So that's the reason I picked it. So hopefully it's the same for you guys. And get it to advance here. So one thing that I'll just throw out there, kind of the chicken and the egg concept that I often talk about, discuss, and debate is: do we allocate resources and then schedule them? So we provide project managers with a resource pool, a percentage allocation, and they schedule within those parameters, or are we pulling data in from schedules, from project managers or all other sources, and then that builds up our allocations? Or do we do both? And often what I find, it's a combination. And kind of the topic of perfect schedules, that's very kind of debatable. It's a very good question. What is a perfect schedule? And how much time should a PM, project managers, spend polishing schedules, making them perfect, versus leading a project? It's a very interesting question. What's more important for a project from a project manager's perspective? Having all the work, all the dependencies, tracking completion, getting the project completed, meeting the objectives, or getting their allocations so that the portfolio group or PMO or resource management team can do their job. Some of the best project leaders, and you notice I use the term project leader, I often shift to that, are often not the most detailed schedule keepers, which is interesting. Many times project schedules are really a good planning tool. And then sometimes I notice that when the project gets into, issues, risks, problems, changes, a lot of times schedules can come apart during the execution phase. And how much time, should a project manager be spending on that, making it perfect? And then there's the trend over the last 10 years, probably, Agile. Agile doesn't use critical path scheduling. So how do you get resource allocations out of your Agile teams? And I've often heard, Agile has dedicated teams, so resource management doesn't matter, which I don't believe is the true answer. So I like to step back and, if you're doing resource portfolio management, before you dive too deep and get into the details, just remember there's the strategic element and the strategic goals. So, we're really trying to forecast resource for future needs and looking at roles and skills, looking 6 months out, looking a year out. The other thing is we're often trying to answer questions with these 20 projects running. When can this new project that's just come up, a new business need, when can it start? What roles and skills should we be looking to hire or make contracting decisions on, or major decisions as an organization? We are really trying to focus our resources on business strategy execution. So with all the resources we have, how do we make sure that we are feeding those most strategic projects? We're also trying to optimize allocations across very large resource pools, and we're trying to react to business change. All that being said, there's this balance that we need to do to have this very strategic view and this very detailed view when it comes to schedules, building schedules, and pulling that scheduling data into our resource portfolio management. So some more observations, just kind of what makes me want to talk about this topic is I often have seen in my own personal experience or having discussions with a great hesitation to even try to plan or forecast before we have complete compliance and all projects have schedules and we're running those perfectly. I don't believe you need to hesitate. I think the earlier you can begin, the more strategic you can become quickly. And there's a fact that not all projects have schedules, or not all projects are being run by true project managers. I think it would be rare in an organization where that is pure. Not all schedules have accurate allocations, and I'll just dive a little bit deeper to talk about that topic because I think that's one of the key areas of schedules and resource planning come together. Detailed schedules often change, but you often may not be material to the overall strategic view. And then, of course, again, we'll talk about agile teams that may or may not believe that they need resource planning because of the dedicated teams where everybody's 100% on a team. So just to dive into just a very kind of granular discussion, yet very important discussion. When you look at a true project schedule, critical path project schedule, you'll have duration, you'll have work, you'll have resources assigned to the tasks, and then you need one element that I often find, even in the best schedules, best project managers, is the ability to have what I've got highlighted here on the right hand of the side of the screen is at that task level, every task and every assignment, does it have a percentage allocation? I often find that that's not the case throughout a schedule, and that's usually where it breaks down. So the approach that I take and kind of try to frame this and maybe help guide how do you deal with all this, right? And there's really two lenses that I look at for every project, or in total across all projects. It's phase, what phase is the project in? Because that would be very different and very important. And whose perspective and who's providing the data? Project managers, resource managers, portfolio managers, etc. So from a project phase standpoint, you must consider which phase it's in, and the three that main groups that I break this into are the project intake or portfolio planning, kind of the big picture, early stages, and then there's specific to each project going through a project planning phase. I know Mark talked about, and I like the concept of the demand factory. It kind of aligns with that. And then there's the project execution phase. So you really must know what, when you're looking at a project and whether you should have the scheduling data or allocation data, you really need to know what phase that project's in. So talking about the project intake or portfolio planning phase, you typically don't have PMs assigned. In a lot of ways, you don't have a schedule. You certainly don't have a detailed schedule. You probably have a lot of either named resources or probably more demand planning or generic resources by role. You have a lot of uncertainty of your demand, potentially if your project intake is customer projects, timing, whether it's going to go forward, probability of going forward, etc. And then, there's the planning horizon. Is it probably kind of depends on what, if you're professional services or IT, but, I would say a lot of times I'm dealing with 6 months or 2 years out. So it's a longer planning horizon. So then we go to projects that are maybe in the planning phase. They've been approved to move forward. Conceptually, you've got to go through requirements, but you typically probably have a PM assigned, but you often don't even know what the solution is. You don't know what the details of delivery will be, the implementation phase. So you really don't have anything but what's it going to take to get through planning. Kind of the concept of your PMI, I'm probably heard of progressive elaboration. So kind of phase-based elaboration of schedules. Mostly probably duration-based estimates at that point in time. not work-based estimates. You're probably dealing with, the tasks are more difficult to estimate, gathering requirements, things like that, architecture, project scoping, things like that are really difficult to estimate from a true scheduling standpoint. And the horizons probably maybe, relatively speaking, more in the 3 to 6 month range. So then go to the true execution of phase of a project. This is where you optimally would love to have PMs assigned. The schedules are all detailed schedules. They're all really nice schedules, work-based schedules typically, and maybe with some duration based in there. The allocations, they can quickly change in this phase. As you all know, that as soon as issues occur, risks occur, the schedules are probably changing very quickly. And that's where you decide, well, how often do you want to get updates from that? And then there's, again, the agile delivery. I would say that it's very predictable at this, is that teams, and for a period of time, that's a very easy resource allocation problem to solve. So that's actually some of the convenience of agile teams and dedicated teams. And then the next perspective that we talk about is just, who's providing the data? Who is this? Project managers, resource or portfolio managers, depending on your organization, or functional managers? You always need to be considerate of who are you asking to provide data? Do they understand or appreciate what the goal is of resource planning versus what they might be doing on their scheduling level or the team's level? So project managers, I would say they're really mostly care about their project only. They're not as concerned about other projects and other resource demands. They view allocations within their single project, so often they'll be looking at over allocations within their project, but not necessarily over allocations of that resource across a portfolio project. They just need to know who is available for them to schedule, and that's their focus. And they care more about the tasks and the resulting so their task and the completion of those tasks than they do the allocation data that it might be providing to management or the PMO, et cetera. And they really often, I find, don't want multiple sources of data to update. So they don't want to update their schedule, then update this allocation data separately. So you've got to solve that. And don't always maintain their allocations like I showed in the detailed example at every task level. I've not often found that any schedule has that perfectly done. And they may focus on critical resources only, so they may not be really showing all the resources in their schedule or really focused on all the resources on the project. And then there's resource managers or portfolio managers or PMO level, really trying to look at the big picture across projects and trying to answer those strategic questions of when can this project start? What resource roles do we really need to look at? Some of those big picture questions, which is very different than a project manager at the detailed level. I would say that some data is better than no data. And then directionally correct is good enough sometimes, especially when it's not material to the overall picture. And you need to understand the quality of the data, the PM schedules, before you just start pulling all the schedules in and assume that data is correct. Often you find that it might be, the data may not be best to pull in. It may be better to get summary level allocations from project managers, be more accurate. And the other thing is, when these projects are in the intake phase, or even sometimes in the planning phase, the portfolio managers or the resource managers may need to provide those estimates. And it's like, well, how do you do that without a schedule? And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Then functional managers. Functional managers are focused on their team. Who from their team is assigned and over allocated, or what projects have they been promised to, and they're often trying to protect, hopefully, from over allocations, but that's really their focus as a functional manager. So what I'd like to kind of shift to is like, okay, so how do we deal with this? What are some tools and techniques and maybe best practices that try to keep us at a strategic level and be able to deal with the fact that we may not have perfect schedules across our organization for all projects that we're trying to do resource portfolio planning with. So some of the key tools that I often use within Tempus are opportunity maps. Very interesting, concept because it even says this is, directionally correct type of information. So the example I have up here is, if I could start this project and I could only get 80% of those resources or 90% of those resources, I'm still interested in digging into that. So it's not an exact science, but it's a directionally correct management level strategic view and decision-making tool. A wonderful tool within Tempus to get alignment of project managers and functional managers or even resource managers and portfolio managers is this resource request process. The handshake, the contract between the need of a project and the changes that are happening day in and day out or week to week, if you will, on projects can be communicated via resource requests. Great process and something that I found is very impactful to get everybody aligned. And then, the other one I'm showing here is really demand planning by role. So, it's really in net across aggregated across projects, what is the demand for a particular role? In this example, I'm showing the QA role and our capacity, and how do those projects stack up? And where do we have problems, maybe by month is what I'm showing here. So these are Tempus reports that I've just pulled that data, summarized it, and looked at a by role planning. And again, you don't need perfect data to make these types of decisions. The other Tempus tools that I use typically to try to look at a strategic view of things is the use of project templates or proposal projects. I have on the right hand side, you can see here just a small sample of just creating a profile of a project and typical phases, typical resources, typical hours of allocation or weeks of duration, etc., to use as templates, especially in the early planning phases when we don't have project managers, but we can say this project is our typical 6-month application project or large 9-month projects. And you can see here just an example of that in the in my Tempus scheduling tool that I'm using. And then the other key thing, and I kind of talk about it, is planning by phases. So typically resources and allocations shift by phase. So even if you don't know the details of a project and you don't have a schedule, but you know the profile of a project, there's a lot we can do with how resources are needed with each phase, definition, requirements, design, development, and how those allocations change over time, and paint that picture and use that for that type of project when we're looking at it in the portfolio view. And then lastly, the other, well, not lastly, but one of the other things is, topics that often is pretty discussed at a lot of conferences, and just especially in resource management, it's a little bit confusing at times, is dealing with Agile. So in my experience, I actually use a tool called Jira Portfolio, which is a very much more portfolio planning, kind of higher level management tool that can pull data from specific Jira projects information and start doing what's called release planning or product road mapping, or even what I would call agile portfolio planning. And as you can see on the right hand side, this is just a snippet, a visual, just to kind of show you that even though they are dedicated teams, resources are 100% in theory, with allocated to a project, products have phases. Products have, life cycles. There's beginning and ends. There's, spin up of product teams, and then there's shifting of resources to other product teams. So you should, in essence, be able to use that view, that summarized view, without getting into the details of sprint planning and all the details that maybe go into individual JIRA project management, and pull that into a higher level strategic view and get some resource data at that level, because that's really the level I think that's important to resource portfolio planning. And then the last thing I'll put out there is that, a more recent, or at least for me, more recent discovery has been the Resource Management Institute, and it is a specific to resource management, and it is a place that we can all kind of gather for best practices. And it has a lot of it has a process called just-in-time resourcing, which will hit on helping, how do you forecast, how do you, do staffing, skills inventories, and all that relates to how do you look at resource management best practices across industries, be it professional services, be it enterprise IT, product development, and then I believe agencies is a new one that they've come out with. So if you haven't seen that, really a good source for white papers and discussions, and that's the Resource Management Institute. And one topic I have here that I didn't talk about was, really, I fundamentally think that project managers, when they are running projects, the data needs to come from them. And the trick is, how do you get them to understand the goals of resource portfolio planning, and that perfection isn't necessary for them to feed good data, but they own the project, they own the details of that project, so they should be the best source of information. That's a tricky balance. And then functional managers really focusing on their teams and making sure that they're managing the workloads of their teams, and not necessarily sometimes want to represent the projects themselves. So in conclusion, I just wrap up with kind of hopefully the message that you've gotten is that, don't hesitate to plan or to make strategic decisions until you've had the perfect data, or you've pulled in all the perfect schedules. And then just learn to deal with the ambiguity, maybe directionally right or good enough, when you're looking at the aggregated data across large sets of projects and large sets of resources, because strategic business decisions need to be made quickly, and the business changes quickly, and if you wait too long, it might be too late. And then, the last point is, we want to be in resource portfolio planning, we want to be adding strategic value, and you need to keep an eye on that. So the quicker that you can do that, the better it is for your company and yourself as a team. So with that, I'll just throw out there my email if you ever want to contact me, talk about this, debate the topic. I would love to have more discussions. I think it's a very important topic, especially when you're maybe new to implementing Tempus and you're trying to figure out, how do I pull in schedules, and when do I pull in schedules, and what if I don't have schedules, etc. So again, thank you for your time, and hopefully this was valuable to everybody.